Hello, everyone. Thanks again for coming to our weekly DS Talks. It's my pleasure to introduce Nikos Ntoumanis. Nikos is a professor of motivation science here at SDU in the Department of Sports Science and Clinical Biomechanics. Nikos completed his PhD in medical sciences at the University of Exeter in '99 and spent most of his career at the University of Birmingham. He then moved to Australia to Curtin University from 2014 onward, where he established a research group there and had a primary research role. And he just joined SDU less than a year ago. It's summer of 2021. Now, Nikos is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Psychology and Sports and Exercise, Psychology of Sports and Exercise. And he's published quite a bit of work. He has 2 books on statistics and over 250 peer-reviewed articles and quite a few book chapters. His work has been cited over 36,000 times. I actually checked, you wrote 36,000. It's 37,000 now. You have to take your bio, I think. And he's received quite a bit of research funding from Europe, from the UK, and from Australia, as well as funding from industry. So please join me in welcoming Nikos.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for making the time to come to my talk today. I will talk about the role of motivational factors in promoting sustained behavior change, and I'll give examples of my work. And before I start my talk, actually, I want to thank DS for the kind invitation. I'm fairly new, as Anthony mentioned earlier. I haven't been here for a year, so I still would like to meet more people and discuss opportunities for collaboration. So my talk has 3 purposes. First, I would like to introduce some key concepts and frameworks in terms of motivation and behavior change. And obviously, given the comprehensiveness of the topic, I will only give some examples for illustration purposes. I will give a couple of examples of my past work, which I undertook in Australia. And I'll make the case for a new center, a center for motivation and behavior change at SU. I will explain why I think this center is needed and what it could offer. So a few words about me. I come from a small island in the southeast of Greece called Kos. Some of you might have been there. There are charter flights in the summer, and my most famous compatriot is Hippocrates, the father of medicine. This is my wife, Cecilia, who's also a professor at IOB. And we've got 2 girls, Anna Maria and Zoe. This photo was taken in Australia a few months before we got on the plane to come to Denmark. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm Greek, and from my name. I spent most of my adult life in the UK. I did my postgraduate education in the UK. I worked most of my career in the UK, apart from the last 7 years where I was in Australia. In Australia, I was in the School of Psychology there, where with some colleagues, we established the Physical Activity Wellbeing Lab, and we did a number of projects, and I'll present a couple of these projects today. I describe myself as a motivational psychologist. I'm interested in issues that have to do with motivation, why people do certain things or avoid doing other things, and how the social environment helps us motivate us or sometimes puts us off from doing certain activities. I use both work in the laboratory and field work. Today, I'll give you examples mainly of my field work. And my main area of research has to do with physical activity promotion. I'm working with different clinical and community samples to identify psychological barriers and enablers in terms of physical activity participation. I also work in the context management. I'm interested in factors that predict psychological well-being. And I've done a little bit of work in school settings and work settings, which I'm not going to talk about today. I think I have this slide twice. Right. Usually my talks I start by introducing this model. This model is a model that was published in The Lancet by Bauman and colleague, and shows the different factors that affect physical activity. But in fact, this model could be applied for other types of behaviors, not just physical activity. My expertise is mainly on the individual level, the psychological factors, and the interpersonal level, how the social environment shapes what we do. But I would like to acknowledge that important and complex behaviors, such as physical activity, are influenced by a multitude of factors. I'm just one piece. My research is just one piece or a couple of pieces of the puzzle. I really like motivation. I've been working in the field of motivation ever since I got my PhD. Actually, before I got my PhD, while I was working on my PhD, because motivation underpins what we do and what we don't do. And it's probably one of the most popular topics in the field of psychology. And it really attracts a lot of attention from lay people. So if you go on Amazon and search for motivation, you'll see all kinds of books, self-help guides, videos about what you should be doing, or what you should avoid be doing. And some of it have good advice. Some of the advice there is actually scientifically unsound. And you see motivational posters everywhere. So if you go to the gym, certain workplaces, different catchphrases that are supposed to inspire you, to make you change. And one of the most popular ones, and one I hate, is never give up, and I'll explain why. It's actually the wrong message. So there are probably 30, 40 different, maybe more, theories of motivation. And I've worked with 4 or 5. Today I will illustrate one I've used a fair amount. It's called self-determination theory, and I'll explain why this theory has some potential in terms of helping us understand behavior change. As you can see from the website of this theory has been applied to a wide variety of domains outside in health, but also outside health, in terms of workplace, education, social issues, environment, etc. And what I like about this theory is that, unlike other theories and lay perceptions of what motivation is, it makes a distinction between the quantity and quality of motivation. Often we make the assumption that the more motivated someone is, the better outcomes this person will experience. And this is often the case, but not always. We as parents perhaps might motivate our kids by inducing guilt. We are in workplaces where, no, not at STU, but there are workplaces where managers motivate by threats, by fear of punishment. So we know that there are ways, quick fixes, as I call them, by which we can get people to change. However, these quick fixes come with consequences in terms of psychological well-being and the quality of behavioral engagement. And what we found is that these quick fixes, the low qualities of motivation, actually do not produce sustained behavior change. So what we need is not just high quantity of motivation, but high quality of motivation. And this theory identifies a number of different types of motivation, some of high quality and some of not so high quality. When it comes to exercise, and I have a few slides around physical activity because I'm based at IOB, and obviously physical activity is a topic I work with a lot. We often try to get people to change by using the wrong types of motivation, by inducing guilt, fear, shame, associating exercise with something unpleasant, something that has to be done. But we know that exercise is difficult when you have to do it, but easy when you want to do it. And that actually applies to a lot of behaviors, right? So when you enjoy doing something, you don't really think about doing it, you just do it. So how do you create environments within which individuals motivate themselves and do what they want to do? Well, this is a fairly complex model, which I'll try to break down. Let's look at the different types of motivation here. So according to the theory, there are some high quality, some different types of motivation that are high quality. So think of any behavior. It doesn't have to be exercise. It could be why you're in this room. It could be why you work. So you could be doing this behavior because you enjoyed it, because you see value in it, or because it's part of who you are. It's part of your identity. And these are different types of motivation related to some extent, but not necessarily identical. For example, I might run for half an hour on the treadmill, not just because I enjoy it, but because I value the benefits of being active. And a lot of things we do in our daily lives, we don't really do them because of the sheer pleasure we get. We value what we do and what we get out of these activities, even though we don't necessarily enjoy these activities. So these are different types of motivation that are high quality. And when we try to promote behavioral engagement, we try to identify conditions within which individuals will be motivated based on these motives. And then we have the low quality of motivation that is based on shame, of trying to fit in because you want the approval from others, guilt of not doing something. So if you ever exercise because you'll feel guilty for actually being inactive or missing an exercise session, you're motivated by this type of motivation. We can also motivate by, as I say, by threats, by fear of punishment, or by giving people rewards to change. And the topic of rewards, I'll come back to that, is quite contagious. Some people like using rewards as a way of changing behavior, and some people actually say this is a no-no. And I think under certain circumstances, rewards have the ability to undermine motivation, but not always. I'll come back to that in a minute. And obviously, there are situations where we are doing something without having any motivation. And usually, we are one step from dropping out. So how do we promote high-quality motivation? By creating social environments within which we satisfy three basic psychological needs. And these are the needs: the need to feel in control of what you do, the need to feel good at what you do, or the need to feel accepted and meaningfully related to your social environment. So think of anything you really enjoy doing. It could be exercise, but it could be anything else. It could be a leisure activity you enjoy doing it. Chances are you're doing it because no one is forcing you to do it. You have autonomy. If the activity is skill-based, you're good at it. And if the activity involves interacting with other people, you actually get along with these people. And equally, there are activities that you hate doing. It could be household chores. These activities, you're doing them because someone is forcing you. It could be you who's putting pressure on yourself. So you have low autonomy. If the activities are skill-based, you're not good. For example, when it comes to dancing, I really suck at dancing, so I don't really like do dancing. And if it involves other people, then you're not really getting along with these people. So when we create interventions using this theoretical framework, being in terms of promoting physical activity, school engagement, better working environment, any kind of behavior, we try to create conditions within which one or all three psychological needs are satisfied. These needs are innate and have been found to be important across different cultures, even if they are not consciously valued. And the way we try to foster these needs, because we know if we foster these needs, we're going to have high quality motivation, is by creating what we call need supportive environments. And we can do that by training people in position of authority or expertise, train teachers, work managers, healthcare professionals. We could train significant others in someone's life, the spouse, to communicate in ways which we call need supportive. And we can also do it not just with face-to-face training. We can use technology. We can develop digital interventions using apps where we create communication styles which are need supportive. And just to give you an idea of what need supportive style is, this is a consensus paper that came out in Motivation Science. Applies to the health domain, is any type of health behavior, but these behaviors I'm going to show you now could be used for other types of behavior, not just health. And there are 3 columns. This is a consensus statement from a group of experts in terms of which behaviors from a significant other foster autonomy. For example, giving choice is a good way of doing that. Giving a rationale, why you're doing something. Relatedness, building environments within which people will feel that their anxieties, their fears are acknowledged and given opportunities to interact and mingle with others. And competence, how to help people develop skills and experiences that will increase the high quality motivation. So when I work and colleagues of mine work, when we use this theoretical work to change behavior, we train significant others to use some of these techniques. Of course, we're not always, probably if you think of your experience, you haven't always been in a social environment within which someone above you communicates with you in need supportive ways. And the flip side is the need thwarting, as we call them, behaviors, the communication styles that undermine the psychological needs. There hasn't been a similar consensus process by which to identify them, but these are some examples of a study we did in the exercise setting where essentially need thwarted techniques are techniques that undermine all 3 needs by being coercive, manipulative, by demeaning someone's contributions to the group work, or by rejecting others. And you can do that either to their face, or you can do it in a more subtle way. So you accept them only if they behave as you would like them to behave, and you reject them when they try to behave in their independent ways. So just to give you an example of probably an extreme need thwarting strategy, this is from a boot camp in the US, the video, and shows you how need thwarting strategies can be manifested. About this video is the instructor started by saying that I really want to help these people. Okay? And you might think, well, there's an oxymoron there, but the reality is that in our social environments, we come across these people, perhaps not to this extreme, where they really think they're helping us. They're trying to motivate us. And that's the biggest problem, I think, in the motivation literature, that people often have good intentions. They're not necessarily evil, but they're basically using all the wrong techniques to motivate us. So in the programs that we've done while I was in Perth, we developed communication training programs which we delivered to various individuals in position of authority and or expertise. It included face-to-face training in terms of identifying, explaining to them the what we call the bright and dark side of motivation, about communication styles, communicate in need supportive and need thwarting ways. And we gave them one or more of these. For example, we gave them rich descriptions of how they can, in a particular context, they can communicate in more need-supportive ways, and how they can reduce the need-thought in ways of communication. We did that by face-to-face training. We also developed apps within which, and I'll give you an example later, within which this communication was embedded. We helped them to apply skills, developing action plans and reflection diaries. And we offer essentially a package, intervention package, to help these individuals to foster high quality motivation by supporting individuals' psychological needs. And we apply them in various trials we did with exercise instructors. Also, I think my battery has run out. Also with physiotherapists, working in contexts where people had low back pain or osteoarthritis or type 1 diabetes. So this is just one example of an intervention approach, but a lot of the theories that we use assume that humans are always rational. And probably you're all highly educated people, you know that's not true, right? We're not always rational. We often act on our impulses. So in psychology, we have these dual process models, and we have on one side the control processes where we make pros and cons of, is it worth changing my behavior? What are the pros and what are the cons of this? And we reflect on our beliefs, on our attitudes. And self-determination theory is just one example of a control process model. But we know that often our behaviors are based on more automatic processes. We have these automatic reflections, attitudes, in terms of whether we like something, whether we dislike something. We have habits which sometimes drive our behavior without consciously thinking about them. And when it comes to habits are actually sometimes quite difficult bad habits are quite difficult to get rid of. Or when we try to build new habits, again, there is a process by which we build these new habits, and these habits, some of these habits take longer time to build than others. But the reason we work with habits is because we know that habits bypass our control system, because we don't have to exert so much self-control when we try to engage in behaviors. Another way in which our behavior is not rational is because we have certain biases, and behavioral economists have identified some of these biases, such as loss aversion, present bias, and they have actually exploited them in trying to change our health behaviors. So, for example, it is a fairly well-known fact that if you promise people, say, $10 for every week they stick to a weight loss program, up to $100, or if you tell them, I'll give you $100 and I will subtract $10 every week you don't show up to the program, people will be more motivated to stick to the program. In the latter case, although the amount is equivalent, $100 in both cases, we're motivated by loss aversion. And there are other biases that behavioral economists have identified, and this kind of biases actually quite powerfully driving our behaviors. So when in the behavioral science literature, we work both with the control side, the beliefs, the attitudes, the motivations. We also work with the automatic processes in terms of building habits, exploit biases, decision biases, to try to get people to change their behaviors. Another model I want to introduce is the COMP model, which is probably one of the most frequently used models in the behavior science literature. And this model essentially is a model that identifies, it's a fairly complex model, which I'll try to break down, identifies different drivers of behaviors and at different levels. So essentially, at the core, this model is a wheel, as you'll see in a minute. And at the center of the wheel, the major predictors of behaviors are capability, competence, opportunity, and motivation. So, and these three interact to influence behavior. And capability could be both psychological and physical. I'm physically able to change my behavior, and I'm ready. I don't have the fear to change my behavior. In terms of motivation, this model distinguishes between automatic and deliberate processes. And in terms of opportunities, identify both physical and social opportunities or barriers to behaviors. So according to this model, these are the three proximal predictors of behavior. But how do we actually intervene and change capability? How do we intervene and change opportunity and change motivation? The COPI model actually proposed an integrated framework of behavior change, which actually was based on a review that Susan Mickey did at the University College London of a number of different behavior change frameworks that were applied across a wide variety of human domains. And she came up with this framework, which essentially, as you can see, is in the form of a wheel with motivation, capability, and opportunity being at the center, but also identifying a number of different intervention factors by which we can change behavior. So we can change behavior by education, and we know that for certain kind of behaviors, just telling people it's good for them to change their behavior will not necessarily change their behavior. And we have this problem, for example, in terms of physical activity promotion. But anyway, education is a very powerful intervention tool. We can use, we can pay people to change their behaviors, we use other incentives, we can threaten people. There are a number of different ways in which we can intervene. And these intervention functions are here. And here there's a mapping exercise with which you can identify, in terms of capability, opportunity, and motivation, which intervention factors are the most likely to work. And the blue boxes here map each intervention function with its predictor of behavior. So for example, if we're interested in changing physical capability, the best way of doing this is by using enablement kind of interventions. But this model actually goes one step further. If you think of the integrated model I presented earlier in terms of how behavior is influenced by big level factors, big picture factors such as policies, and identifies a number of different policies that could be implemented to change behavior. And again, so for example, in terms of policy, coming to Denmark and Odense, one of the things that had an immediate impact on me was the fact that I cannot drive around the city center. That's a policy intervention, right? In Australia, I drove everywhere. So it's much easier for me now to meet my step count goal every day because of this intervention in policy. And again, there are matrices by which you can map policy categories to different intervention functions, and using a process of by which we can identify for which policy different interventions functions would be more effective. And you can break the model even further down by identifying behavior change techniques, which are the active ingredients of behaviors. So behavior change techniques, and there are 93 of them, they're grouped in a number of different categories, are the actual ways by which we can intervene. And when you look at the intervention factors I mentioned earlier, these intervention factors could use a number of these behavior change techniques. And one behavior change technique, such as social support, could serve different intervention factors. For example, social support could be both an enablement intervention, it could be a modeling intervention. Anyway, the process is fairly complicated. Basically, when you do this behavioral diagnosis using the behavior change wheel, you identify a number of behavior change techniques, intervention factors, and policies, because not all of them actually are appropriate or acceptable or relevant to the behavior you're trying to change. And you're trying to change this behavior, the target behavior, in a more focused way. Of course, there are a number of ways in which you do that, and one of which is you use the criteria which determine how acceptable and how costly and how effective different behavior change techniques are, because obviously these criteria, which require significant user involvement, will determine which of the ingredients you're going to use in your recipe. There are other intervention frameworks which we use in the behavior change literature, which I don't have time to talk about today, such as the intervention mapping approach. This approach, that you have a really good understanding of motivation behavior change literature, because you have to pre-identify the approaches, the theoretical approaches you're going to work with. But anyhow, these are some examples in which behavior change science can help us to identify the major drivers of the target behavior. But behavior change science can also help us in terms of developing appropriate methodology tools. And this is the ORP tool, which, although it's been developed in the obesity context, could be used for any kinds of behaviors, and identifies how we shouldn't really jump into RCTs, how we should do a number of different preparations, stage exercises by which we develop some pilot studies and test certain ideas and methods, and how progressively we move into phase 3 efficacy trials, which then we try to upscale into effectiveness trials, which are trials that are implemented at a large scale. Or this is another approach of mine, which I like a lot, which it comes from engineering, actually, and essentially says that before you jump into an RCT, where you throw in different intervention components, you do optimization trials, which you can do in a number of different ways, by which you identify which are the most potent, cost-effective ingredients of your intervention. And through these optimization trials, you develop a smaller tool of the most effective intervention techniques that you then take to an RCT. You can, of course, use other theoretical frameworks which are important in terms of evaluating intervention, in terms of its reach, how effective it has been, how well it has been implemented, the fidelity with which it has been implemented. And there are frameworks for that, such as the REAM framework. I'm conscious of the time, so I'll move to an example of a couple of studies we did in Perth. This is a trial where we try to change, to intervene and to change behavior. We focused on nutrition and physical activity, and we looked at overweight, actually mainly obese, footy fans. Footy is the Australian football. And we work with the 2 premier clubs in Western Australia, the West Coast Eagles and Fremantle Dockers. And the reason we focus on men is because men are underrepresented in community programs for weight loss, but also in terms of RCTs. And there are a lot of reasons why, one of which has to do with perceptions of masculinity. So in this program, we developed both classroom-based education around healthy eating, but also a physical activity program. and we use the appeal of spectating. Middle-aged men like to watch professional sport, and footy is the most popular sport in Western Australia. So we used the context of professional sport as a way of hook this man into a weight loss program. And we use some of the behavior change techniques I mentioned earlier to try to change their eating and physical activity habits. And we use technology to do so. These are some examples from the education program and the physical activity program. As you can see, these men were actually pretty heavy. The mean BMI was 35, so these were obese individuals. And we saw at the end of the program, adjusting for baseline differences and for baseline values and group differences, we saw a reduction in 3% in terms of weight loss, which became greater at 6 months. We saw improvements in perceptions of health, improvements in diet, objectively assessed physical activity, habits, and I don't have the time, I have to skip that. At 6 months, the improvements actually became larger. It was we used a health economist. I like to work with health economists. I think they add significant value to the projects that I do. And the health economists estimated that the cost of this program would represent a good value for money in Australia in terms of healthcare. And just before I left, we had some funding to expand this program and focus on more clinical groups, people with cardiovascular disease and people in more remote areas. We also work with some of the examples I've given you are examples where we train people who are experts on something to change the behavior of others. But sometimes this is not sustainable. And we were interested in identifying whether we can train lay people to become more need supportive. And we did that in trials in work settings and also in retirement homes, where we developed working groups and we identified peer leaders within these groups to lead walks. We trained these leaders to use the techniques I mentioned earlier. We developed apps where we identified certain behavior change techniques that are important in terms of changing the target behavior. And we communicated messages about changing behaviors in more need-supportive ways. I'm really running out of time. Okay, so I'm interested in goal striving. This is an area where I would like to do more work, and I'm fascinated by questions why we always stuck in the middle of our goal setting process. Why we find when we set a goal, why do we find it easier to start with and finish the goal, and why do we get stuck in the middle? How do we actually give feedback to people when they're during the goal setting journey? Do we focus on the progress they have made to date, or do we focus on what needs to be accomplished? Do we focus on seeing the glass as half full or half empty? How do we help people when they manage with multiple goals? Right? The reality is we in our everyday lives we have personal goals, we have health goals, we have career goals. How do we manage these goals successfully? How do we deal with temptations that stray us off the pathway we want to follow? It could be a dietary temptation. It could be a sedentary temptation. How do we incentivize goal pursuit? Do we use the stick and the carrot approach? And I wanted to talk about a project which I'm not going to talk now because I want to talk about the center for 5 minutes. In a project that I'm running at the moment, funded by the Australian Research Council, I'm looking at these issues of self-regulation, and I'm challenging the notion that it's always good to persist, because this notion, although it's quite prevalent in whole movies, in education settings, in politics, in TEDx talks, basically, I think it's not always good to persist. we have to be flexible in our goal strivings, and sometimes we have to give up, because giving up actually helps us to accomplish other goals which are important. And I'm doing studies where we're testing this notion in the laboratory, but also in terms of people who have financial goals, and also new parents that juggle career goals and parental goals. And I would like to finish by going to the last part of my slide, and Anthony, I'll make sure I'll finish in 5 minutes, no more than that. One of the things that excited me about coming here, and there was the opportunity to develop something new. And I've just got today this URL link for a new center, which is actually not a physical center. We don't have a building. It's more of a virtual network. It's the center focusing on motivation and behavior change. And I'm very fortunate, if you go to this website, to see that I have managed to secure the agreement of a number of distinguished collaborators from across different faculties in STU, experts in their fields, very accomplished people. So I'm going to learn a lot from these people. And they work with a number of different behaviors. The traditional approach to intervention design actually is this one. Anyone knows what this acronym stands for? Okay, so why do I think we need this center at STU? Because we're really working with issues that have to do with motivation, behavior change all the time. It could be in the work setting, it could be in education, it could be in terms of sustainable environment, it could be in terms of changing health behaviors. And we try to change people's motivation at the personal level, or we try to create social environment within which we motivate people. And sometimes we're able to do that, sometimes we're not so good at doing that. And I think using a frameworks from science literature can help us to develop interventions by understanding the successful pathways of behavior change. And there are lots of applications, not just in terms of physical activity and eating, I mentioned before, but also in terms of other important behaviors, one of which, for example, is vaccination uptake. And obviously, the issue of COVID vaccination and how much it's been actually adopted is been in the news the last couple of years, maybe not so much in Denmark, but in a lot of other countries. Medication adherence is a massive problem in the medical literature. I've talked to a lot of physicians that say that basically we do need to do more in terms of getting people to take the medication. Sometimes the reason they're not taking the medication could be because they forget, but there could be some other deeper issues. In terms of getting people to adhere to screening appointments, in terms of in the workplace, understand for example, the incentive structure. The world crash in 2008 was actually because of not just the flow, the pervasive incentivization system. And so looking at incentives in the workplace, looking at leadership styles in the workplace is important. Education, high stakes testing, does it produce the outcomes we want to produce? Environment is an issue that is actually becoming, environmental sustainability is an issue that's becoming actually more and more prevalent by the day. And behavior change science can help not just in terms of theoretical frameworks, it can help in terms of methodologies. And I gave you some examples before of how we can use different methodologies and tools to understand and change behavior. And the center, obviously, when you develop something new, it's good to have a target and something you want to aspire to. My aspirations are the two very successful centers, one in London and one in Melbourne, and they cover broad types of behaviors. And I hope in a few years we'll be able to achieve some of the success. And basically, if you're interested in this center, please get in contact. I'm interested in not just addressing specific challenges as how do we get people more active, how do we help people to deal with dietary adaptations, but also more generic challenges. For example, transition to retirement, unemployment, the challenges of parenthood, where people need to change behaviors in a number of different ways. And this kind of generic questions require a more interdisciplinary approach that this center could offer. And this center has people from a number of disciplines, health economics, behavioral economics, nutrition, digital health. You'll see if you visit the website. And I'm still talking with a few more people, provide expertise in areas where I think is needed. And we offer to, we will try to conduct not just research, but also consultancy and develop material that will make behavioral science accessible to the wider public. I had a very funny video to finish my presentation, but I'm running out of time. So I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. My name is Nina Bonopdon. I'm from Department of Design and Communication. Could I ask you to expand a little bit on, or be more concrete, perhaps, getting from the kind of motivation from the overall rationale, which in many of these cases are framed really negatively. I mean, the reason why I should sort my garbage is that the world will collapse if I don't. We should spend less energy for the same reason. I should exercise more, not to live longer. Well, that's a nice way of framing the latter part, but so as not to die as early. But at least in terms of the sustainability issues, the overall rationale is how to formulate in a way that is not just hiding very obviously the negative rationale, as I see it. I mean, the overall rationale.
Yes.
Yeah, and so how do we? But I quite agree that the motivational side of being told that all the time is partly you say, okay, I just can't take it anymore. I did 30 years, right? So how do we work with the overall rationale concretely and make that positive?
Yeah, that's a very good question. At the same time, it's a very quite complex question because there are a number of factors that determine the answer to this question. For example, how long the behavior will last. If it's just for a few minutes, or is it something you have to do for a long period of time? Who else is with you? What is at stake if you don't do the behavior? What are the possible consequences for you? So I don't think that it's possible to give you an answer because a lot of qualifiers that will determine how to go about. But I guess if a quick answer would be to try to identify some value in the behavior, even if it's not for you. It could be for your people around you, or it could be for the community at large. And if this behavior is over a long period of time, try to build some enjoyment into it. Of course, if it's just taking out the garbage, obviously, that's a quick behavior, right? But if it's marking 180 essays as an academic, all right, so I mean, I don't think any of us became an academic because we like marking student work, but there are other things we enjoy more. Try to build some enjoyment to it, and there are different ways in which you can do it. One extreme, it could be using distraction and focus or strategies. The other one is rewarding yourself by accomplishing sub-goals. For example, treating yourself for marking every 20 dissertation student essays. There are a lot of different ways you can do it. But essentially, this question is too complex to be given a generic answer because it depends on the factors I mentioned earlier.
Thanks so much for your talk, Nikos. I have a question about a methodological issue that I think is kind of in the background of some of what you've been discussing, but wasn't discussed explicitly. And it's a question about the difficulty of actually identifying someone's motivations. So in some of the examples you gave of certain studies, it seems like we don't really need to know someone's personal motivations, but you can set up an environment and you can see if it brings about the behavior that you want to bring about. But you were also talking about values and our personal identifications or identifying with certain groups. And one challenging thing about us as human beings is that we often aren't very transparent to ourselves. We don't know why we behave in certain ways or why we don't behave in certain ways. So to what extent is it actually a challenge for this field? You didn't really discuss the challenge of getting to this kind of insight, but insight that most of us don't have, at least fully, into ourselves. It seems like it's the kind of insight you need in order to figure out what is actually motivating someone's behavior in any of these cases.
Yeah, so I think that understanding people's motivation and the values, beliefs, attitudes is very important in changing behavior. I didn't say they're not important. I think they're extremely important. And there are different ways you can do it. For example, a classic technique that is used for that is motivational interviewing, where you sit down and identify why someone wants to change or doesn't want to change their behavior. For in terms of smoking cessation, some people actually may not want to quit smoking, right? Because for whatever reason, all right? So you also have to acknowledge and respect that some people do not want to change their behavior. You can't really force people to change their behavior, right? Sometimes also it's a matter of understanding what gets people to do certain things or avoid doing certain things. And so understanding more the habits they have, doing things automatically, good habits, bad habits. I think it's not just about creating a social environment within which people will change. It's also about understanding what the major barriers and enablers at the personal level. I think it's pretty important, and make sure that people want to change for good reasons. It's both the personal factors and the contextual factors that come together to produce a good intervention package, I would say.
Thank you. We have a question from Mustafa, who's with us online. Thank you for a great lecture. And he asks, what is known about the factors maintaining long-term motivation for healthy behavior, which is usually not addressed in short-term studies mentioned in your lecture?
What are the factors that promote sustained behavior change? Right, that's the $1 million question, because we do know there are lots of reviews of, for example, behavior change techniques that are associated with sustained behavior change. This is not an easy answer to this is not an easy question to answer, but the reason is that it's difficult to sustain behavior change over a long period of time. But and there are a lot of different factors why this happens, because sometimes the reason could be people move from one context to the other, and the other context actually doesn't support them as much in changing their behavior. Or often in interventions, when it comes to health behavior interventions, we do them in group settings, and then when the 12-week RCT will end, people are left on their own. They don't have the skills necessarily to maintain sustained behavior change. I guess a consistent factor in my experience of what helps people to maintain behavior change is identifying behaviors that people are intrinsically motivated to do, people that they enjoy doing, and behaviors that help them support their basic psychological needs. And recently conducted a meta-analysis of the applications of self-determination theory in the health behavior domain. And we looked at a number of different behaviors, from flossing your teeth to actually going to screening appointments, or to do physical activity, to eat better, and autonomous motivation, motivation-based, the high-quality motivation I mentioned before, and perceptions of competence, where the two most significant predictors of sustained behavior change are the long-term follow-up of every RCT we examined.
I had a question.
Thank you, Nikos. very simple question. What motivates you to work with motivation theories?
Right. I'm a very driven person. So I guess this question was asked to me because I was giving a talk last week in the University of Ghent in Belgium, and I was asked exactly the same question by the person who was going to introduce me. So I'm prepared for that, Jens. I guess I did reflect on that, like why I'm interested in motivation, and I think it comes from two factors. When I was at school, I couldn't help but noticing how different the motivation levels were within my classroom. How some kids were so engaged and wanted to learn more, and some kids basically had absolutely no motivation to do their homework, and they fell behind. So I wanted to understand what are the factors at the personal level and also at the teaching level that influences motivation. But also because I very much enjoy sport from an age, I wanted to understand why some people push themselves to such extreme that they become world-class athletes. And on the other hand, you have people who are what we call couch potatoes. They can't get themselves out of the couch. And the problem we have at the moment when it comes to physical activities, and nearly everyone, at least in the developed countries, knows that physical activity is good for you, but not everyone does physical activity, enough physical activity. So, and these were some of the reasons why I was interested in understanding motivation, what drives behavior, and why some people are so easily, they're highly driven to do things, and others actually you really have to push them hard to move. Thank you.
If there are no more questions, then let's give a hand to Nikos.
Thank you.